In 2009, a team of geneticists at Stanford University fed DNA samples from 938 people, drawn from 51 populations on every inhabited continent on Earth, into a computer and asked one of the simplest questions science has ever posed. The results, mostly, made sense. Europeans clustered with Europeans. East Asians clustered with East Asians. Africans showed the deepest genetic roots of all, exactly as the out-of-Africa theory predicted. Every population on Earth fell onto a neat, branching tree of human migration. Every population except one. There was a group of people whose DNA refused to behave. They lived on a small chain of islands, isolated for thousands of years. Their language was unrelated to any neighboring tongue. Their physical features didn't match the populations surrounding them. And when geneticists looked at their genome with the most sophisticated tools available, they found something that should not have been there: sequences of DNA that didn't come from modern humans at all. They came from a species we believed had vanished from the planet 40,000 years ago. That was the first crack in the model. But it would not be the last. Because on the other side of the world, in a high-altitude valley in Colombia that most of the world has never heard of, a different team of scientists was in the middle of making a discovery that would split the model open entirely. Archaeologists had been digging through layers of ancient earth north of Bogota since the early 1990s, recovering human bones, some of the oldest ever found in South America. At the time, researchers cataloged them, noted how elongated the skulls were compared to other regional remains, and moved on. They had no tools to understand what those bones were hiding. 30 years later, when scientists finally decoded the DNA inside those ancient fragments of calcium and collagen, they found a people who simply should not exist. A group of human beings with no known ancestors, no known descendants, and no match in any genetic database on Earth. A lineage that lived, breathed, and then vanished without leaving a single trace of itself in any living person alive today. Not in Colombia. Not anywhere in the Americas. Not anywhere on this planet. 2 ghost lineages. 2 continents. 2 vanishings so complete they left behind only bones and silence. This is the story of what modern genetics has found when it looked into the human past with real precision, and what it has done to everything we thought we knew about who we are. The human genome is approximately 3 billion letters long. Written out, it would fill thousands of books. Every cell in your body carries an almost identical copy of it. And yet, no 2 people on Earth, outside of identical twins, have the exact same genome. The differences between any 2 human beings are staggeringly small, less than 1% of the total sequence. But those tiny variations are everything. They are the fingerprints left behind by time. Every mutation, every small change in the genetic code, accumulates at a measurable rate, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. Scientists use this rate like a clock. By comparing the genomes of people living today and, increasingly, of people who have been dead for thousands of years, researchers can reconstruct the movements, separations, and reunions of human populations going all the way back to the very beginning of our species. The first major revolution came in 2000 when the Human Genome Project completed its work and Craig Venter stood in the White House and said plainly that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. What he meant was this: when scientists gathered genetic samples from people who self-identified as members of different races and compared their DNA, the variation within any so-called racial group was greater than the variation between groups. 2 people who both call themselves black may be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from someone who calls themselves white. The categories that human beings had spent centuries fighting over, legislating around, and building entire social systems upon had no meaningful foundation in the actual chemistry of life. Race, as a biological concept, was an illusion. But that revelation, as important as it was, turned out to be only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, as the technology for reading DNA became faster, cheaper, and more precise, scientists began pulling genetic material out of ancient bones. From Neanderthals. From a teenage girl whose finger bone had been preserved for tens of thousands of years in a cave in the mountains of Siberia. From people buried in tombs across Europe and Africa and Asia. And what they found rewrote the human story entirely. In 2009, scientists extracted and sequenced the first Neanderthal genome. The results answered a question that had haunted paleontologists for generations. Had modern humans and Neanderthals ever interbred? The answer was an unequivocal yes. If you are of European or Asian descent, approximately 1 to 2% of your genome right now came from a Neanderthal ancestor. That fact alone was extraordinary. But within a year, something even stranger was announced. From the same Siberian cave system, researchers recovered the bone fragments of a completely unknown species of human. Not Neanderthal. Not Homo sapiens. Something else, something that had never been seen before and had left no physical record beyond a single finger bone and a molar tooth. Scientists called them the Denisovans. And what was remarkable was not just that they existed, but that they too had interbred with us. Denisovan DNA is present in living people today, particularly in populations across East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. And when scientists compared the DNA of all three species, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, they found something that made even the most seasoned geneticists pause. The numbers did not add up. There was more ancestry unaccounted for than could be explained by these three groups alone. The shadow of a fourth human species, one for which we have no bones, no teeth, and no direct DNA, appears to be embedded in our genome. We carry the ghost of a people we have never met and cannot name. This is the world that modern genetics has revealed. Not clean, separate racial lines stretching back to some tidy origin point, but tangled, overlapping lineages. Populations that split apart and came back together. People who wandered and mixed and disappeared and left behind only the faintest chemical traces of their existence. And then the complexity deepened in ways no one had anticipated. In early 2025, a team of researchers from the University of Cambridge published a paper in the journal Nature Genetics that stopped the scientific community cold. Using a new computational model they had developed called COBRA, they analyzed full genome sequences from living people drawn from populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What they found was evidence for something that had been hiding in plain sight inside every human genome on the planet. Every single one of us, they discovered, is the product of a merging event that took place roughly 300,000 years ago. But the populations that merged had been separate for a very, very long time before that. They had diverged from each other approximately 1.5 million years ago. That means that for over 1 million years, two distinct lineages of our ancestors lived on this earth, evolved in parallel, and then eventually came together in a mixing event that gave rise to modern Homo sapiens as we know ourselves today. The researchers identified these as Population A and Population B. Population A was the larger group. At some point shortly after the original split, it went through a severe bottleneck, a catastrophic collapse in numbers, before slowly rebuilding over hundreds of thousands of years. This group ultimately contributed around 80% of the genetic material that all modern humans carry. It was also the ancestral lineage of both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, which explains why our DNA overlaps with theirs in the ways that it does. Population B contributed the remaining 20%. And crucially, the mixture of these two populations is present in every modern human alive today. In every person in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, in the Pacific Islands, this ancient merger is the common inheritance of our entire species. What makes this finding so striking is the sheer scale of the contribution. We had known about Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in certain populations, but those contributions are small, around 1 to 2% for Neanderthals in non-African populations. The contribution from Population B is 10 times larger. 20% of every human genome comes from a population that diverged from the main human lineage 1.5 million years ago, rejoined it 300,000 years later, and yet had remained entirely invisible to decades of genetic research because no one had built the right model to look for it. The identity of Population B remains a mystery. Fossil evidence suggests that species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis were living in both Africa and other regions during the relevant time period, making them plausible candidates. But we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that the human family tree is not a tree at all. It is more like a river system, with branches that split and converge and split again across millions of years of deep time. To understand the full strangeness of what genetics is revealing, you have to travel to one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. The Andaman Islands sit in the Bay of Bengal, halfway between India and Myanmar. They are a chain of more than 500 small tropical islands, most of them uninhabited, covered in dense rainforest that has barely changed in 10,000 years. For most of human history, the people who lived there had no regular contact with the outside world. No traders reached them. No empires conquered them. No religions converted them. They lived as they had always lived, in small bands of hunter-gatherers, using bows and arrows to hunt wild pigs, fishing with nets in the shallow coastal waters. When European ships first encountered the Andamanese in the late 18th century, the sailors were shocked. The people on these islands looked nothing like the populations of mainland India just a few hundred miles away. They were short, often under 5 feet tall. They had very dark skin. They had tightly curled hair. To the Europeans, they looked African, but they were thousands of miles from Africa, on an island chain surrounded by populations that looked completely different. For 2 centuries, anthropologists argued about who the Andamanese really were. Some thought they were descendants of shipwrecked African slaves. Others believed they were a relic population, the last survivors of an ancient migration wiped out everywhere else. Without genetic evidence, it was all guesswork. Then the genome sequencing began. When scientists extracted DNA from members of the Andamanese tribes in the early 2000s, they found one of the most genetically isolated populations ever documented. The Andamanese had diverged from other modern human populations between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, placing them among the very first wave of humans to leave Africa. In the rest of the world, that first migration wave had been absorbed, replaced, or overwritten by later populations. Farmers from the Middle East, steppe nomads from Central Asia, Bantu expansions across Africa, layer after layer of newer peoples had erased the genetic signal of those original travelers. But not on the Andamans. On those islands, the first wave had survived in genetic isolation for tens of thousands of years. That alone would have been a discovery of historic proportions. But there was more. Buried inside the Andamanese genome were sequences that were not modern human, and not Neanderthal either. They were Denisovan, the same archaic species whose bones had been found in a Siberian cave thousands of miles to the north. This made no sense under the existing model. The Denisovans had supposedly lived in Siberia and possibly East Asia. Their DNA was supposed to have entered the modern human gene pool somewhere up there. But the Andamanese had been isolated on their islands for 50,000 years with almost no genetic exchange with the outside world. So how had Denisovan DNA gotten into them? There was only one answer that fit the evidence. The Denisovans must have lived much further south than anyone had realized. They must have been present in Southeast Asia, possibly across what is now Indonesia, the Philippines, and the surrounding islands, when the first wave of modern humans came through on their journey east. The two populations met. They mixed. And then the Denisovans disappeared. To put the scale of this in perspective, the Denisovan range, as we now understand it, was larger than the modern range of any single great ape species. It stretched across more than 5,000 miles of Asia, from the frozen Siberian mountains to the tropical equatorial islands of Southeast Asia. And we have almost no physical evidence of this. A finger bone. A few teeth. A piece of jawbone discovered in Tibet in 2019. That is the entire fossil record of a species that occupied a continent for hundreds of thousands of years. Everything else we know about the Denisovans, we know from DNA, from the silent record they left inside the cells of the people they mixed with before they vanished. And then came the deepest finding of all. When geneticists looked at the Denisovan DNA found in Papuans and Aboriginal Australians more closely, they discovered that it didn't come from a single Denisovan population. There were at least 2 distinct Denisovan groups that had contributed to modern humans, and they had separated from each other at least 280,000 years ago. They were so different from each other that some researchers began calling them by separate names. The classic Denisovans from the Siberian cave, and a southern Denisovan group that had lived across Southeast Asia and contributed heavily to Andamanese, Papuan, and Australian gene pools. But even this was not the end. When geneticists examined the deepest layers of the Andamanese genome, the parts that didn't match modern humans, Neanderthals, or Denisovans, they found something that matched nothing in any database. Ancient. Deeply divergent. Unidentifiable. Researchers called them ghost lineages. DNA from a species we have never identified, whose bones we have never found, but whose genetic signature still exists today inside living people on a chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal. Somewhere in deep prehistory, possibly 60 or 70,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Andamanese met another group of humans. Not Neanderthals. Not Denisovans. Something else. Something that walked on 2 legs, made tools, possibly spoke a language, and lived in some corner of South Asia or Southeast Asia. The two groups encountered each other. They had children together. And then that other population disappeared. Every individual, every settlement, every physical trace of their existence. The only thing left of them is a few hundred fragments of DNA inside a few hundred living people on a chain of tropical islands. If those people disappear, the last evidence that this species ever existed disappears with them. On the other side of the world, in the highlands of Colombia, geneticists were finding a ghost of a different kind. When the full results of the Colombian ancient DNA study were published in the journal Science Advances in May 2025, the scientific community reacted with something approaching disbelief. A research team led by scientists from the University of Tübingen in Germany and the National University of Colombia had sequenced the genomes of 21 individuals whose remains had been found at multiple archaeological sites across the Bogotá Altiplano, the high plateau that sits at the heart of modern Colombia. The remains spanned a remarkable timeline, from roughly 6,000 years ago all the way to about 500 years ago. And when the researchers compared the DNA of these individuals against the largest databases of human genetic variation in the world, something went profoundly, undeniably wrong. The oldest individuals, 7 of them, dating to around 6,000 years ago and associated with a site called Chequia near the town of Nemocon, did not match anything. Not ancient North American populations. Not ancient South American populations. Not any known migration wave that had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia 20,000 years ago and spread south through the Americas. Not any group in any database on Earth. They were genetically isolated, unlike any human lineage ever documented. Their skulls were notably more elongated than those of other populations found in the same region, a physical difference that corresponded to a genetic distance equally stark. Scientists call such a population a ghost lineage, a group whose DNA does not appear in any modern descendant, that left no traceable genetic legacy in any living person. The Chequia people were exactly that. Dr. Andrea Casas, a researcher at the National University of Colombia's Genetics Institute, described the moment of realization with quiet precision. When we started to compare these individuals with others from elsewhere in the Americas, we found a lineage that has never been reported. It was a new lineage, and it was gone. Kim Louise Krotka, the lead anthropologist on the German side of the project, was equally direct. We could not find descendants of these early hunter-gatherers of the Colombian high plains anywhere. The genes were not passed on. That means there was a complete population exchange in the area around Bogotá. One group of people lived there for thousands of years and then vanished, and a different group of people entirely took their place, with no genetic overlap, no mixing, no continuity. It is as if a door closed and a new door opened in the same location, with entirely different people walking through it. Where did the Chequia come from? No one knows. They may have been an isolated nomadic hunter-gatherer community that arrived in the Colombian highlands by a route that current models of the peopling of the Americas do not account for. They may represent a migration wave so early and so distinct that it has left no other archaeological trace anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. They may be the remnant of a population that crossed into the Americas long before the main migrations, found itself geographically isolated in the high valleys of the Andes, and survived there in genetic isolation for thousands of years before ultimately dying out, not through conquest or violence necessarily, but through disease, climate change, resource scarcity, or the simple bad fortune of small population size. They were present in Colombia at least 6,000 years ago. By about 2,000 years ago, they were gone. No descendants. No survivors. No continuation. The archaeologist André Strauss from Florida Atlantic University, who reviewed the findings without participating in the research, described the discovery with an odd understatement. This is unexpected. Up to this point, we did not believe there was any other lineage that would appear in South America. The prevailing model had held that the peopling of the Americas was the result of two main genetic lineages, a northern and a southern branch, both descending from a founding population that had crossed from Siberia. That model is now incomplete. There is a third lineage in the Americas, and it does not descend from that founding population at all. It has no known ancestors and no known descendants. It existed, and then ceased to exist, without leaving any genetic footprint in any person alive on Earth today. The study also tracked the other individuals in the dataset, those from the Herrera period roughly 2,000 years ago, and the Muisca and Guayne populations that came after, and found genetic patterns consistent with migrations through Central America. They were part of the familiar story. But the Chequia were something else entirely. The cultural transition into the Herrera period, marked by the widespread adoption of ceramics, appears to have been brought into the region by these migrating groups from elsewhere. The Checua had not been absorbed. They had been replaced. While the Columbian and Andamanese discoveries were reshaping our understanding of specific regions, another study was quietly dismantling the broader African narrative, the one that underlies all human origins. Geneticists had long known that the peopling of Africa was more complex than a single, clean origin story. But a study published in late 2025 in the journal Nature, examining the whole genome sequences of 28 ancient southern African individuals who had lived between roughly 10,000 and 4,150 years ago, revealed something deeply unexpected. Every single ancient individual dated to more than 4,400 years ago showed a genetic makeup that fell entirely outside the range of genetic variation seen in any modern human alive today. Not on the edges of that range. Outside it entirely. They were carrying a large fraction of genetic variants that appear to be unique to ancient southern Africans, variants that simply do not appear in the same concentrations in any living human population. Not even in the Khoisan people of southern Africa, who were long considered to represent one of the oldest and most genetically distinct lineages on Earth. Even the Khoisan, some of whom retain up to 80% ancestry from these ancient populations, had diverged genetically from their ancient predecessors in significant ways. The implication is profound. There are chapters of human genetic history that have been partially erased. They survive in diluted or altered form in living people, but once existed in a concentration we can no longer find anywhere on the surface of the earth. The earliest and deepest divisions in the human family, the lineages with the longest periods of separation and the most distinct independent evolution, are not between the racial categories that human societies have spent centuries policing. They are within Africa, among populations that most of the world knows almost nothing about. The people we have historically paid the least attention to carry the most ancient and complex chapters of the human story. The Denisovan DNA inside an Andamanese woman exists because, 50,000 years ago, some of her ancestors survived long enough and stayed isolated long enough to preserve a genetic inheritance that was overwritten everywhere else on Earth. The ghost DNA in the Andamanese genome, the unknown species that doesn't match anything, persists only because those people on those islands stayed alive, generation after generation, through colonization, through disease, through everything the modern world threw at them. And they are running out of time. When the British colonized the Andaman Islands in the 1850s, the indigenous population was estimated at around 5,000 to 8,000 people across multiple tribes. Within 50 years, contact with outsiders had introduced diseases to which the islanders had no immunity. Measles, influenza, syphilis. The great Andamanese population collapsed from several thousand to a few dozen. Today, the great Andamanese number around 50 people. The Anj are estimated at around 100. The Jarawa, who only made peaceful contact with the outside world in 1998, number around 400. And the Sentinelese, who live on a small island and have violently rejected all outside contact for centuries, are believed to number between 50 and 200. But no one knows for certain, because they shoot arrows at anyone who approaches. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow ignored the laws protecting the tribe and attempted to make contact. He was killed by the Sentinelese within hours of landing on the beach. His body was buried in the sand and could not be recovered. The Indian government chose not to pursue charges against the tribe. They explained, with rare clarity, that the tribe was protecting itself, and that any attempt at retaliation would only put the Sentinelese at greater risk of disease and disruption. So the Sentinelese remain alone. They live on their island as their ancestors did 50,000 years ago. They hunt with bows and arrows. They build small dugout canoes. They speak a language no outsider has ever recorded or translated. Satellite images of their island show small clearings in the jungle where their settlements are, thin trails of smoke from cooking fires, tiny figures occasionally visible on the beach carrying spears or watching the horizon. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, a disaster that killed nearly 250,000 people across the region, a helicopter flew over the island to check if the tribe had survived. A Sentinelese man emerged from the trees and fired arrows at the helicopter. That was the confirmation they were still alive. No further contact was made. No medical aid was offered. No relief supplies were dropped. Inside those cells, in that man standing on that beach with a bow in his hand and the wreckage of a tsunami behind him, is the genetic memory of human species that vanished from the rest of the world before agriculture existed, before any city was built, before any language was written down. Taken together, the Cambridge population B discovery, the ancient southern Africans, the Chekua of Bogota, the Andamanese ghost lineages, what do these findings actually mean? They mean that the human family tree is not a tree. The tree was always a lie, or at least a profound oversimplification. A tree implies clean separation, distinct branches, populations that developed their essential characteristics in isolation and then remained meaningfully distinct. That is the biological architecture that racial thinking requires. Separate origins. Separate development. Separate destinies. What genetics has revealed instead is something more like a river delta, with channels that split and rejoin and split again, with water that was once separate becoming mixed and then separating once more, with no point at which you can draw a clean line and say, here is where one stream ends and another begins. Every living person on Earth carries 20% of their genome from a mystery population that diverged from our ancestors 1.5 million years ago and rejoined us 300,000 years later. Ancient southern Africans carried a genetic profile that no living human fully inherits. In the highlands of Colombia 6,000 years ago, a people existed whose lineage has simply vanished from the face of the earth. In the Bay of Bengal, an isolated population carries the DNA of at least 2 extinct human species, and possibly a third that science has never identified. And yet, in 2025, researchers at the NIH analyzed the genetic ancestry of hundreds of thousands of Americans who had self-reported their race or ethnicity, and found that the two things frequently did not match. Not because the participants were lying or mistaken about their identity, but because the categories themselves were too crude, too artificial, too historically contingent to correspond to the actual biological reality that DNA reveals. The categories were social constructs. The DNA was telling a different story. Geneticists have largely stopped using the word race in their scientific papers. Not because they are being politically cautious, but because the word does not correspond to any meaningful biological unit. What they use instead are concepts like ancestry, population, and lineage, terms that are more precise, more dynamic, and more honest about what DNA actually shows. What DNA shows is that we are all related. Not metaphorically. Literally. Every person on Earth shares common ancestors who lived in Africa. The Khoisan people of southern Africa and the hunter-gatherer populations of Central Africa represent some of the oldest surviving branches of that tree, groups whose lineages diverged from others before the ancestors of most of the world's population had even left the continent. The deepest divisions in the human family, with the longest periods of separation and independent evolution, are not between the categories that race has traditionally emphasized. They are within Africa, among populations that most people in the world know almost nothing about. The researchers who made the Colombian discovery say that follow-up work has already begun, in other regions of Colombia and across South America. They want to know if the Chekua lineage appears elsewhere, whether there are other sites containing the remains of this vanished people, whether there are other places where the DNA record shows a population that simply does not belong to any known chapter of the human story. In 2020, a group of geneticists published a paper in Nature with a quiet recommendation buried in the discussion section. They argued that the genomes of small isolated populations like the Andamanese should be sequenced in full and preserved in international databases, not for any commercial purpose, but as a record of human prehistory. They suggested that these genomes are a form of heritage that belongs to all of humanity, and that losing them would be like losing the Library of Alexandria, except the books inside are made of DNA and the knowledge they contain goes back hundreds of thousands of years. That work is now happening, slowly, and with the consent of the communities involved. The great Andamanese have allowed researchers to collect samples for long-term genetic preservation. The Anj have participated in similar studies. The Sentinelese remain untouched. Their genome, a complete mystery, may never be solved. Geneticists are now searching other isolated populations for similar signals. Small groups in the highlands of New Guinea, tribes in the Amazon basin, hunter-gatherers in Central Africa. In several of these populations, researchers have already found echoes of what was found in the Andamanese, DNA fragments that don't match anything known. Ghosts in the genome. Echoes of extinct humans whose stories were lost when their bones turned to dust. It is a search for ghosts conducted not in haunted houses but in laboratories. not with intuition but with genome sequencing technology that can read the chemical history of a life from a fragment of a 3,000-year-old tooth. What this tells us is not only that we have been wrong about the past, it is that we have barely begun to understand it. For every ghost lineage we have found, there may be others we have missed entirely. For every Chequia or Sentinelese population whose DNA survived long enough to be discovered, there may be dozens of lineages that simply went extinct without leaving any trace at all. No bones, no descendants, no chemical memory in any living cell. The answer that modern science is assembling, piece by painstaking piece, is far larger and stranger and more wondrous than any previous generation could have imagined. We are not the representatives of separate tribes who happen to share a planet. We are the survivors, each of us, of a story that has been unfolding for millions of years across an entire continent and eventually an entire world. A story of people who split apart and found each other again. Of lineages that rose and vanished and left their mark only in the faintest chemical traces buried in the bones of those who came after. Of a species that is, at its core, a single complicated family with an extraordinarily long and tangled history. If you have ever looked at a DNA ancestry test and seen small percentages labeled as unassigned or ancient ancestry unknown, this is part of the reason. We are still discovering who our ancestors were. We are still finding chapters of the story that no one knew were missing. The Chequia of Bogota existed for at least 4,000 years in the highlands of Colombia. By 2,000 years ago, they were gone. Not absorbed. Not continued. Simply gone, replaced by a different people with no genetic overlap, no trace, no memory. The only thing they left behind was bones. And inside those bones, for 30 years, a secret waited. A lineage that didn't fit. A chapter of the human story that no one knew was missing until suddenly, finally, we found it. On a chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal, a few hundred people carry inside their cells the genetic memory of human species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Species whose bones may never be found, whose names will never be known, whose languages are permanently and irrecoverably lost. The only thing left of them is DNA. A few hundred fragments. Inside a few hundred living people. And those people are running out of time. Every one of us is the endpoint of an almost unimaginably complex web of ancestors, reaching back not centuries or millennia but millions of years, across distances we cannot fully conceive, through catastrophes and migrations and encounters and extinctions that have left almost no trace except the faint chemistry encoded in our cells. We are not clean. We are not separate. We are the product of every meeting, every mixing, every moment of connection across deep time that allowed our particular chain of ancestors to survive long enough to produce us. The human family tree is not a tree. It is a forest. And we are only beginning to understand how many species once grew there. The question now is not only who the Chequia were, or who the Sentinelese carry inside their cells. The question is how many others are still out there, waiting to be found, buried under the indifferent earth, carrying in their ancient chemistry the memory of a world we have entirely forgotten. And the more urgent question, how many of those living windows into that forgotten world are we going to let close before we have the wisdom to look through them? The bones are patient. The DNA persists. But the people carrying the oldest stories are fragile and finite and running out of time.